So this was like, we're at the frontier of my ability to make PowerPoint slides right here. I made this earlier this week, and I apologize for the rudimentary shapes. But I wanted to illustrate what I thought were three big ways that the field is talking about these two distinct things and how they either complement or work against one another. So the first bucket that probably many of you are living in your classrooms and school systems is just a pedagogical point, which is that blended learning as a delivery model can complement a competency-based progression, right? So if we're actually trying to have each individual student move on when they're ready, when they've demonstrated competency, blended learning is a way to effectuate that sort of flexible pacing by delivering content on an as-needed basis and assessing on demand, right? And that to me was a very clear overlap from the start in doing my research. Now, that doesn't mean, the reason I've illustrated this as a Venn diagram, it doesn't mean that all blended learning programs are competency-based by any stretch of the imagination, nor are all competency-based education programs taking advantage of technology. And you can definitely have a competency-based program that is tech-free, or that's just tech-rich, like students may be using computers, but you may not actually be delivering content online. Similarly, you can have students very much squarely in a seat time based system, but that are exposed to blended learning models. And so I think that's just one way to clarify that there's an overlap, but they can also function sort of exclusively on their own. The second chart I have up here on the top right is actually how we probably think about the relationship of competency-based and blended here at the Christensen Institute. And it's sort of a market analysis framing. So like I said, Michael Horn and Clay Christensen wrote the book Disrupting Class and illustrated that online learning was rapidly growing in K-12 education. And they posited that this could be, and I emphasize could, this could be a really good thing for students if online learning grew in a student-centered way. In other words, if we use technology to actually differentiate it to a degree and with precision that was never before possible, even for amazing teachers who had great instincts and skill sets around differentiated instruction. It simply was not possible to do at scale, as many of us know, in a classroom with 30 kids. The question, though, is that online learning could also grow in a way that is not at all revolutionary and that simply digitizes our existing seat time-based system. And we've seen that happen in some states, and I think it's actually where you have where the skeptics of sort of online blended digital learning have a real case to make, right? Like if we're just putting students in front of computers and delivering content much in the way that a traditional lecture looks, and we're not leveraging technology to personalize, that's actually not particularly revolutionary or interesting. And so where competency-based, particularly policy and sort of philosophy comes in, is that it sets the conditions for online learning to grow in a way that is far more personalized and that actually really does break that traditional factory mold. So in that sense, online learning, again, like the first example, it's a delivery mechanism. It's growing because the market is turning to it as an affordable solution, but competency-based education policy hopefully sets the market conditions that happens in a way that's good for kids. The last piece here is sort of a less optimistic look at where the field is headed, but I have had a number of conversations in the past year that make me think that this is a real possibility. And that's that online learning advocates and providers see themselves somewhat at odds with competency-based education advocates and vice versa. And I think that we can trace this to the historical trends of these two movements, so to speak. So competency-based education predated online learning for obvious reasons, right? Like the technology simply wasn't in place until about 20 or 10 years ago to even deliver online learning in the way that we're seeing now. Competency-based education, on the other hand, the concept started to pop up, well, let's be real, it popped up initially with sort of the tutorial model that's been around forever, right? Because in a one-to-one tutoring situation, you're really only advancing when you're ready, and there's no incentive to have you do otherwise. But competency-based education as a term and a sort of concept in education and curricular reform emerged in the middle of the 20th century in teacher education programs. And the goal there was really very much a curricular reform. It wasn't so much focused on a pacing reform, but the emphasis was on how can teachers who are preparing to enter the classroom, how can we ensure that they can show what they know, and that they can really actively do what we think they need to be able to do, right? And that's, Marcia was mentioning before we started this morning that we're hearing a lot in higher ed around competency-based education. The way that that term is being used in higher ed, much like it was being used in the middle of the 20th century, is really around what are your skills that you can apply in the workplace, right? That's sort of the movement in higher ed. And that emphasis on doing and demonstrating what you know was really at the heart of competency-based reform at the beginning. Not surprising then that many folks now sitting around the competency-based table in K-12 are incredibly focused on assessment reform, performance assessment, and deeper learning. Now, those are all really important facets, I think, of a well-functioning personalized system, but you can imagine that the way online learning has grown up is actually very different. So early online learning was almost exclusively about access, right? It wasn't reinventing teaching and learning as we know it. It was delivering learning to students who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. And that was in the form of credit recovery programs and early learning labs. That was in the form of AP online courses at rural and urban schools that otherwise couldn't offer those courses. And that's really where online learning got its start, as an access play, not a curricular reform play. And so as blended learning has sort of grown up, there's certainly new sort of visions of what curriculum and teaching and learning look like in a blended setting. But the emphasis on deeper learning, on projects, on performance assessment is only sort of a recent part of that conversation. And so when you have people sitting around a table, and maybe they can even agree to the vision in that first bucket pedagogically, that blended learning could in theory support competency-based education, but there's a very different sort of philosophical DNA to these two movements that can make it feel like folks are talking past each other. The last thing I'd say there is that online learning, after sort of the initial access play, it really became about anytime, anywhere learning, right? And so the emphasis on flexible pacing for individual students has really been a big play in the online blended learning space. When I think certain competency-based advocates hear about flexible pacing, the fear is that we're just sort of churning students through a learning progression and never really going deep on topics, never sort of pulling out to do deeper inquiry or sort of interdisciplinary projects, which they feel is sort of near and dear to what true competency-based education is. So I know I spent a long time on this slide, but to me, this is like, as practitioners in the space, as advocates in the space, we have to be incredibly crisp about how these two are complementary and how the sort of camps, which are not mutually exclusive, but the two camps of competency-based and blended can sometimes work against each other.